who is the Helen LeBaron Hilton Chair of the College of Family and Consumer Sciences for this academic year. I'm Suzanne Hendrick, and I'm Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs in the College of Family and Consumer Sciences. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Hilton Chair, a little bit about Stephen, and about some of the work that he's doing with us this year. Helen LeBaron Hilton Chair is named after the late dean of our College of then Home Economics, Helen LeBaron Hilton, who was and may actually be one of the, if not the longest tenured dean of a college of its kind anywhere. Served in that role during the 1960s and 70s. Her estate endowed this chair, which is a visiting scholar position. And I think that the choice of Stephen Brookfield for this position really honors her legacy very well. She was known, and is known, as someone who really pioneered a focus on public policy in the home economics profession, now family and consumer sciences profession, to try to really focus on policies that would internationally improve the well-being of children, women, and their families. And I think that you'll get a sense from some of the things that Stephen will talk with us tonight about, that he shares a commitment to well-being and to advancement of improving quality of life for everyone on the planet. You may notice in the back some buttons and posters and bookmarks. I hope that you'll feel free to take those. The college is celebrating the theme of transforming lives, and Stephen is working with us to transform our thinking and to help our students to develop their critical thinking skills as a part of a newly adopted core curriculum in our college that focuses on that, as well as developing interpersonal communication abilities. Stephen Brookfield comes to us as a distinguished professor at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. So it's not too inconvenient a commute for him to come down here approximately one day a month during this entire academic year. And if you're interested in interacting with him further, you can just look at our college homepage, and off of there is a page for the Hilton Chair, describes the calendar of all the times that he'll be here. Dr. Brookfield has a background in adult education and education in general and critical thinking. He's published a number of books, including the ones that you see over here that I thought was really nice, that Public Lectures set that up for us, and also one called Discussion as a Way of Teaching. And he is certainly one of the internationally recognized experts and leaders in helping people to think about critical thinking and to help teachers develop better ways of helping students to learn about critical thinking. He's working with the College of Family and Consumer Sciences this year to help our faculty to work on our curriculum, and I think he really exemplifies the spirit of transforming lives, and welcoming him this evening.
Thank you. This is so nice. Someone arranged to have tea here for me, which was extremely considerate. And sounds like we have some partying in the background or something. Anyway, being asked to give a public lecture like this is a source of honor and also a source of terror. It's a source of honor because it's based on the assumption, at least I think you're asked, because people think you have something meaningful to say, and that is a source of honor. It's a source of terror because people think you have something meaningful to say. And very frequently you feel that you're probably the one person in the room who doesn't have very much that's meaningful to say. And in fact, one of the things that intrigues me as I study teachers and how teachers reason about their practice is the way that a sense of impostorship is a very frequent element of a teacher's life. Impostorship is the sense that you can fool some of the people for some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time, and sooner or later people will realize you don't know very much and can't do very much, and the mask of command that you wear will come crashing down in a very humiliating public moment. And I think a lot of teachers go through life with that feeling, and I do. I've been teaching for 33 years now, and I keep wondering, when is the penny going to drop in the minds of my colleagues, and people are going to step back collectively and say, how on earth did we hire this person, and how can we get rid of them as quickly as possible because I do something that's so outrageously bad. And a real trigger to impostorship is having to give a public lecture. One thing you should probably know about my autobiography, since we're going to talk about critical thinking, is that I have a big problem, I think, as a teacher of critical thinking, which is that what I call critical thinking is something that's always sort of been second nature to me. I don't ever think of an episode that I went through and I suddenly said to myself, so this is what critical thinking is. Now I have to change how I look at the world and how I think and how I make decisions and take actions to do it in a critical way. Because I've always sort of had an interest in asking, well, why should we think this, or why should I behave this way, or what assumptions are you operating under? You set a classroom up this way, or you ask me to write an assignment that way. So as a teacher, when I work with students who are trying to learn how I would define thinking, and they have great difficulty doing it, I think one of my problems is that I don't have a lot of autobiographical memory of struggling with critical thinking to draw on, because I wouldn't say it's been easy, but it's been a natural way of thinking for me. And I think in many ways, the best teachers are those who have struggled significantly as learners, but have reached a level of competence which allows them to teach the subject in which they teach, in which they're qualified to teach. And when I'm on search committees, and I've been on a lot of them hiring new faculty, one of the things I'm very interested in is looking at undergraduate records of someone who has a PhD in the same area. And if someone, as an undergraduate, has a very low grade point average, but manages to get up through masters and through to doctoral level and has achieved some eminence in their field, I tend to think they're probably going to be a better teacher because they have an awareness of some of the struggles that their own learners are going through. Whereas a teacher who's just aced it all the way through and has never really had to grapple with the fear of failure at any deep level, it's going to be hard for them to understand how their own students experience the fear of failure. So I think one of the gifts, although I have a detriment as a teacher of critical thinking, which is that, it's never been that difficult for me to see its value. On the other hand, as a learner, I don't have a good history of study. I failed to get into university, in fact. When I was 18, I failed a whole third of my high school completion exams in England, where I grew up. So I ended up going to a local technical college and getting into an undergraduate degree, but then at the end of the undergraduate degree, my scores were well in the bottom half of the class. So I couldn't get into graduate school, and I really wanted to get into graduate school because I was having a big party at undergraduate school, and I didn't want it to end. I didn't want to have to go out to work. So I called up a local university and said, you really have to let me in. It's unfair to exclude someone just on the basis of an application. Managed to talk my way onto a master's degree course, and then failed the examination at the end of the master's degree. And I was told by the committee that I had 6 weeks to write a special paper, and if it was good enough, they'd give me the master's degree, and I managed to do that. So as a student, I have a history of performing badly on standardized tests and examinations. And I think that does hold me in good stead when I'm working with other students who have the same problem. One of the things I got interested on very early on in my career was working on courses in study skills for pre-college freshmen, and for people who had a real fear of examinations and of studying formally standardized curricula. And then when I got into being a university professor, one of the duties I volunteered for was to teach students how to prepare for required doctoral examination for them to have doctoral candidacy at Columbia, where I used to work before moving out to Minnesota. And my theory was that as someone who had a real struggle with taking exams, but who managed to get through eventually and achieve some success in education, I would be a good teacher to work with other students who are struggling with this same problem of how do I perform well on a standardized test when I don't have a good history of doing that. So that's the kind of private autobiography behind the public persona that Suzanne was introducing and that the books over there sort of represent. I want to talk about critical thinking as focusing at its core on this activity of hunting assumptions. So I'm going to start off by sort of defining critical thinking. I want to talk a little bit about how it's experienced by learners, because as a teacher, trying to help people think critically, one of the most important pieces of information I need is how is it experienced emotionally as much as cognitively. How do people live through having their assumptions challenged and being required to research some taken for granted perspectives and to look at things from different vantage points and so on. And then maybe I'll end up saying a few things about how this helps us teach critical thinking, and then we'll kind of see if there are comments or questions or any energy left at all in the room this late on in the day. Research on lecturing shows that even at the highest point of attentiveness, 12 minutes is about the optimal length for which you can speak and have people retain information usefully. That's in a very interesting meta-analysis of research on lecturing by Donald Bly. It's called What's the Use of Lecture? It's a very interesting book on this. But I've never been able to restrict my comments to 12 minutes. So, I've constantly, knowing the research on good teaching very often doesn't translate into practicing the implications of that research. So critical thinking as hunting assumptions. My rough and ready definition of critical thinking is that it's the ability that we have to uncover those assumptions that guide how we think and how we act, to make those often implicit assumptions explicit, to bring them out in the open so we know assumptions are informing our actions and our behavior. Then to be able to research those assumptions and say, are they well grounded? Do they make sense? What sources of evidence do I have that these assumptions are accurate? Am I following these assumptions because an authority source has told me that they're accurate, but I've never really questioned the credibility of the authority source? Or am I following these assumptions because somehow my experience has taught me that they're accurate and valid? One of the best ways I think that we can judge whether assumptions are accurate and valid, one of the ways we can research them, is to look at those assumptions, look at our behaviors and beliefs from as many different perspectives as possible. So a strong part of critical thinking for me is being able to step outside of your mental framework and look at your assumptive clusters, the assumptions that guide how you think, how you act, how you take decisions and make choices, from a variety of different perspectives, and to see how those assumptions look, often to other people who are in a situation with you. Then hopefully, after having made your assumptions explicit, research carefully, looked at them from different perspectives, you're then in a better position to take an informed action. An action that is grounded in well-researched evidence, an action which has a better chance of having the consequences that you want it to have, and an action that you can explain and lay out the rationale for to anyone who is interested. Those would be the three sort of conditions that an informed action meets. It can be explained clearly and thoughtfully, the rationale for it can be laid out. It's based on well-researched evidence which can be made explicit, and it has a reasonable chance, or a better chance, of achieving the consequences it's intended to achieve than it otherwise would have. So for me, critical thinking is not an abstract thing that you learn in university curricula. It's a basic survival skill of life. If you don't know what your assumptions are that lie behind how you build friendships, how you build marriages, how you act with work colleagues in a workplace setting, how you act as a community member, participate in the political process, how you view television and decode media messages, how you decide on the internet what websites are to be trusted and what websites should be regarded skeptically. If you can't do that kind of thing, it seems to me you're going to have a tough time surviving in this world. So for me, critical thinking, a core process of uncovering assumptions and knowing what our assumptions are, being able to research them and get a sense of whether or not they're accurate, that's a basic survival skill of life. And to me, if there's anything that qualifies as a lifelong learning project, it will be learning to do that. Learning and relearning and relearning. Because for me, critical thinking is not something where you take a course in it and then you get certified in it and you can kind of put it behind you and move on to something else. It's a continuous learning process just woven into the fabric of your life and woven into the fabric of your reasoning processes and your practices in whatever field of work you inhabit. And often when I'm introducing critical thinking for the first time, the kinds of examples that I use are extremely practical and recognizable. One of my favorite ones is from my experiences as a parent. One of the things, being English, I have nightmares about, is being embarrassed in public. This is sort of like the deepest sin an English person can commit, is to feel public embarrassment. And my kids frequently embarrass me in public. And particularly when they were younger and we would be in a restaurant or on a bus, in the subway, on a plane, wherever, some kind of public place, my kids often would start screaming for candy. They'd want me to give them some chocolate or something to give them a sugar rush. And if we were in a public place and my kids start screaming for candy, I would give them it as a way of keeping them quiet. Anything to avoid making a scene is my sort of rationale. So in that situation, my assumption is that if I give my child what they want, they will be quiet, and therefore I will avoid this situation of public embarrassment. That's a causal sequence. If I do this, that will happen. Of course, it was actually often empirically wrong, because after they had their sugar for a temporary while, then they hit a sugar high, and it would be even worse, but I didn't really think it through very carefully. Then we get home, out of the public setting, we'd be sitting down for dinner that night, and my kids would say, you know, I don't want broccoli, or I don't want this source of protein, I want candy. And my wife and I would say, well, you can have candy after you've eaten a fruit, a vegetable, and some protein. So we'd have this whole sequence of behaviors the children had to participate in before candy was given as a reward. So on the same day, in a situation which to my kid looks the same, they're asking me for candy, I'm operating in two different settings from two different sets of assumptions. The interaction, kid asking for candy, looks the same, but the assumptions that I'm using in each setting are very, very different and lead to two completely different forms of behavior on my part, which is extremely confusing to my kids, who can't understand which is the right setting. Is they're asking for it in the plane the right setting, or they're asking for it at the dinner table is the right setting. But I think it makes the point that behind the simplest interactions that we have with other people are sets of assumptions, often sets of causal assumptions about the effects that our behaviors will have on the people with whom we interact. And so assumptions are not some sort of mystical thing that you discover in a course on logic or philosophy in college. Assumptions are the building blocks of your actions. They're what really guide the choices and decisions and actions you make. And that's why, for me, hunting assumptions is at the core of what we do as critical thinkers, and it's the core process as a teacher of critical thinking I try and encourage in my own students. Now, doing this, I think, is very difficult. It's confusing, like the example I just gave of the child asking for candy. In two different situations, I operate out of two different sets of assumptions. So it's not like you can say to someone, well, learn these assumptions, apply them through life, and you'll be fine, because it's so contextually variable. To me, critical thinking, one of the first lessons you realize is that assumptions are very rarely universal, generalizable, standardized. The same assumption that works well in one setting would be inappropriate in another setting, which superficially may look the same, but has some internal dynamics and tensions which make it different. So you start to realize, well, it's not so much that my assumptions will be in error or accurate overall, it's that some assumptions will make more sense at some times and less sense at other times. So you have to become much more aware of contextual cues, of what it is about situations that allows us to trust these assumptions rather than those over here, but these assumptions rather than those over there. Now, to learners, this is very confusing, particularly to students who come to college and expect that a professor is going to say, here is how you need to think, here are the assumptions that should guide how you reason, how you take decisions in your life, here's the assumptions about content or skills which hold true across all contexts that you'll meet. Some instructors do that, but a lot of instructors say, well, it all depends. It depends on how you look at it. It depends on the situation you find yourself in. It depends on what what book you read. It depends on which theory you look at. So it all depends. Learning the importance of relativity and contextualism is a hard lesson to learn, and many people do not want to hear this. They want to hear, no, it doesn't depend. I have the right way for you to think. I have the right way for you to behave, and here it is. And, you know, as someone who, in Iowa who gets bombarded because of your position in the primaries with political visits, I'm always interested to analyze commercials and political persona to see the degree to which political candidates try to exude this sense of certainty. Do it this way, act by this set of assumptions, follow this set of policies, and we will take care of everything. It's almost political death, it seems to me, for a candidate to say, well, you know, it sort of all depends. We all need to figure this out. I need your help. And people say, I need you all, you know, we need to work on this together, but they will do that by still giving the sense that I'm first among equals, and, you know, you'll be my resources, but I really have the wisdom embedded in here. So I think people want to hear that there are unequivocal sets of assumptions which make sense across all contexts. And when, as a teacher, you say, no, that's not true, you're going to have to become expert at figuring out some of these contexts, working out what some of these cues that you need to pay attention to. People are going to resist that, they're going to be intimidated by it, they're going to be threatened by it. So, as a teacher of critical thinking, one of the things I have to learn early on is to deal with a lot of hostility and resistance to it, and to realize that people experience it very emotionally. Critical thinking is not some bloodless, ascetic, wholly cognitive, analytical process. It has elements of that in it, but it's also felt extremely personal. If you start questioning some of your basic assumptions that you've lived by and that you've always taken for granted and always regarded as certainties that you can hold on to, that you're having me read in courses, how can I engage with this on any kind of level footing with the author of whatever text I'm reading, or the practitioner of whichever skill that I'm observing? So people start to get very fearful that they're not going to be able to do critical thinking well. And even the terms critical thinking have this negative connotation that being critical is the same as being destructive and tearing things down. And so a good critical thinker is a great demolition expert. And it's sort of the mental equivalent of someone who plants detonators at the foot of a skyscraper, and then they press the charge, and the dynamite sticks detonate, and the skyscraper just implodes. That's how people think of critical thinking, that if someone's putting psychological detonators in my head, then they're going to explode my assumptions, and everything that I've thought to that point is just going to collapse in on itself. And that's such a frightening thing to contemplate. It's not surprising that students have a very negative reaction to critical thinking when they hear that phrase. So part of what I try and do is emphasize that being critical involves us in a process of appraisal. And sometimes when we're trying to work out which assumptions are accurate, and valid, we'll find out that the assumptions that we've sort of had uncritically and unthinkingly are actually very good assumptions and should be followed. It's just that now we're following them with a higher level of awareness and self-knowledge than we had before. I think a second thing that often happens to people when they engage in critical thinking is they run this risk of committing cultural suicide. Cultural suicide is what happens when you discover a new way of looking at something, and you go back to your friends, you go back to your neighborhood, you go back to your family, and you say, listen, I've got this whole new way of thinking, this whole new way of looking at this subject, or looking at my ideas. And you start talking about this with great enthusiasm, and you expect your friends and your family and your community members to kind of break out into applause and celebrate along with you these great transformations in your thought that you're going through. And instead, what happens is that people start moving away from you, both literally and figuratively, and they start thinking themselves, you're changing in front of me. In a sense, you're betraying the trust that we had in each other, because you're now moving into a way of looking at the world which is not the one that I share, and I'm not really celebrating this with you. I'm feeling very fearful of it, because it seems that you're turning your back on me. And I think they see it as an act of betrayal, or they see it as an act of intellectual arrogance. So you come back enthusiastically and you start talking to people about these different ways you're thinking, the different ways you're behaving, and people start to think, oh yeah, I thought you were a friend of mine, but you're getting too big for your boots. You think you're better than us. And that's the last thing I'm going to have to, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. So one of the things I'm interested in when I look at why students drop out of college is to what degree student attrition is down to this fear of committing cultural suicide. Usually studies of student attrition, that is why students drop out, focus on finance, focus on economics and logistical reasons. They don't tend to focus on the emotional dynamics of learning very much, but I'm convinced that a curriculum which focuses critical thinking, students as they go through it run the risk of committing cultural suicide, and many people just can't handle this, and they can't give up the thought that their families and their neighborhoods and their friendship groups and their peer groups and their communities will reject them, and so they say, no, I need to change my major, or I just need to drop out of college for a while and reconnect with my host community, and this was just a bad idea to begin with. A third thing I think that happens often is that students who start to learn to think critically and question assumptions and look at things from different perspectives go through a kind of loss of innocence. So lost innocence is a very predictable emotional rhythm, I think, in critical thinking courses. And lost innocence, the innocence that is lost, is this innocent belief in the student's mind that if I can just get into college and take these classes, I will get some truth, some unequivocal guidelines, some rules for living, which will help me understand myself, chart a clear course for me in the world, and just resolve a lot of the dilemmas and doubts and ambiguities that I face. So you enter college with this hope, this innocent belief that finally you're going to get truth and knowledge. Nice little kind of packages of truth and knowledge. Then you get into critical thinking, and the prospect of this firm truth that you've come for seems to change to jello, and in your hands you just can't hold it, and it starts to slip through your fingers, and you start to become very scared and think, because you'll ask a question and the instructor will say, well, as I said earlier, it all depends on how you look at it, or an instructor will say, well, what do you think, rather than giving a response honestly to it. Or they'll say, well, it's more important to ask the right questions than to find the right answers, and that's a really good question, and what was your reason for asking it? So the student is left feeling, now where is this truth, this unequivocal knowledge that I came for? It's just slipped through my fingers. It's kind of, or it's like ice, that just melts in front of me. And they start to feel a sense of loss and bereavement and sadness, and they think, I'm never going to get it, and the world, instead of becoming clearer, is just becoming a lot murkier and more ambiguous. So the price of coming to college is that it's just messed things up even more, when I was hoping it would clear things up. So that's one of the things, also the emotional dynamics you can predict will happen in critical thinking. And for teachers, you know, at a lot of places, whether you get promotion or get reappointed or get tenure depends a lot, often, it certainly does at my school, on student opinion surveys, on how they respond to the class. So if you as a teacher are pushing people to think critically and putting them through these emotional realities which are troubling and unsettling, it's very hard then for students to give you extremely high marks for your teaching excellence when you as a student are just feel like you've been cheated and because someone has ripped away the rug from under your feet, and the truth that you thought you'd come for, they're refusing to give you, and they're engaging in these kind of mind games by never answering a question in a straight way and always turning it back to you. So I think learning critical thinking is emotionally unsettling, and it's one of those aspects of the learning process that teachers on my side of the fence really need to be aware of and take account of. So how do we try and develop it in students, given that there is all this fear and uncertainty on their part? Well, I think one of the strongest themes I talk about a lot, and have done here at my time at Iowa State in the last few months, is the way in which teachers, professors, instructors can model in their own practice a commitment to critical thinking. So that before you ask students to engage in critical thinking, it seems to me you or I as a teacher need to demonstrate my own ability to model it in front of them, partly to give students a sense of what it looks like, but also so that I can earn the moral right to turn to students and say, I've struggled with this difficult process, now I feel I can turn to you and ask you to do this too. And it's very interesting to me that research on what most helps students learn critical thinking, over and over and over again, the number one indicator from students is seeing the teacher do it in front of me. So it's not, as I used to think it was, carefully crafted exercises, or the way I take students through a curricular sequence, or the way I set up evaluative measures. All those things are important, but the number one aid to learning critical thinking from student surveys is seeing the teacher do it in front of me, naming what they're doing, telling me this is what critical thinking is, and this is how I'm trying to demonstrate it in front of you. So I'm always thinking as a teacher, how do I model that? Particularly if I'm a teacher who is working alone, as most of us do. You know, I think if you're team teaching, it's much easier to model, say, a critical conversation where 2 or 3 colleagues look at the same idea or skill or content area from very different perspectives and help each other understand the assumptions that each other has. That's much easier to do if there's 3 of you in a teaching team. If there's just 1 of you, it's really hard to do. But one of the ways I do this is if I'm giving a lecture like this, I do 2 things very deliberately. One is at the regular points throughout the lecture, I just kind of walk to a completely different space in the room, and I'll turn back and look at where I was and say, do you realize you have failed to mention anything to do with this? And the reason you failed to mention this is because it's very inconvenient for your argument and questions some of the assumptions you really don't want to look at. Or do you realize, Stephen, that in the last 5 or 10 minutes when you've been speaking about this, you've just very easily glided over some fundamental ethical questions and ethical dilemmas that you really need to address here. And do you realize, Stephen, that looked at from this different theoretical perspective, what you're just maintaining is nonsense. So I'll play this kind of structured devil's advocacy of walking to another part of the lecture room and pointing back to where I was and trying to engage with myself in a point, counterpoint
kind of conversation. And I'll say to the students, what I'm trying to do here is show you that there are multiple perspectives that can be taken on this content or this subject matter. And from where I'm standing here, in this mindset, I see all these problems with what I'm maintaining that I don't see when I'm standing over here and making my argument. Another thing that I like to do, and this drives students crazy, I know this from a lot of student evaluations, is that at the end of a lecture, you know, the rule of lecturing is tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you said. That's what was kind of drummed into me early in my career. Well, I tell them what I'm going to say in the lecture, then I say it, but at the end, I tell them what's wrong or problematic with what I've just said. So the last thing that students hear is about 5 minutes of, here's everything that's suspect with what I've just said, here's what's problematic with what I've just said, here's questions that can be raised, or things that I haven't really ventured close to because they would complicate the issue for me. And here's what in my own mind, I'm confused and unresolved about. So, you know, if you're a student and you come to a lecture and you think, okay, I'm going to take down the points because he's going to ask me about these on the exam, so I can kind of nod off of most of the lecture, but for the final summary, this is how I used to be as a student, because I find it very hard to stay awake in lectures. I'm sure a phenomenon that many of you are experiencing right now. I would say, well, at least the last 10 minutes, you know, he'll give me the summary. It's like reading the last chapter in a book, or the summary at the end of each chapter as a way of cribbing what it's really about. So if I was sitting in the audience and I kind of wake up for that last 5 minutes, and what I hear is, now here's unresolved questions that I have about this. Here are things which I haven't gone into, which really I should have, but I've chosen to avoid for these reasons. Here's the things I'm struggling with on this, and I'd be thinking, you know, I'm going to be in a real bind here when I take the test on this, because, you know, he's not going to ask me about his unresolved issues. He's going to ask me how I understood the content. So, you know, that's another way in which I would try and deliberately model an engagement in critical thinking. And then a third way I do this, which again draws different responses from students, is every week in all my classes I give out an anonymous evaluation tool called the Critical Incident Questionnaire, which has 5 questions about the class that week that all students are required to fill out. In order to get the pass for the course, I have a way of requiring that they do this, and to get a grade for the class. And the 5 questions are: at what moment in class this week were you most engaged as a learner? At what moment in class this week were you most distanced as a learner? What action that anyone took was most helpful or affirming? What action that anyone took was most puzzling or confusing? And what surprised you most about the class? So 5 questions about moments and actions and an element of surprise. Students fill these out anonymously. They leave them by the door as they go out. And then I collect them, read through them, and then at the start of the next class of the next week, first class of the next week, I give a report summarizing the main themes that came out, including all the negatively critical comments, like at what moment were you most engaged in class this week, when it was over, or when you called a break, what was the most distancing moment, in what moment were you most distant in class, couldn't pick one out all the time, what action anyone took in the room was most helpful or affirming, again, calling a break or saying we were finished. What action was most puzzling or confusing? Pretty much everything you did. What surprised you most about the class? That it was even more boring and irrelevant than I'd been led to believe. So I kind of read this back to the students and say, thank you, I need to know that there is this degree of hostility and resentment. Given that we all have to occupy this space for the next 14, 15 weeks, it's best to know what we're dealing with, so we need to do something about this. And then hopefully I can initiate some kind of conversation about it. Well, I do this every week, and while I'm doing this, I'm constantly telling the students, now what I'm doing here, I have set this class up today on certain assumptions about what I think will help you learn, what will best explain the subject, what will best demonstrate the skill, or whatever. I need to know whether my assumptions in setting up these activities are accurate. whether they're valid, whether they make sense in this course. And one way we get to know this is by seeing those actions through your eyes. So by you filling out this questionnaire every week, you're helping me think critically about my own practice as a teacher. You're helping me clarify the assumptions I'm operating under and get a sense of whether or not those assumptions are accurate and valid. And remember, that's exactly what I'm asking you to do in your essays, in your classroom discussions, in your course activities for me. You know, I want you to become aware of your assumptions, to know how you can research them, how you check them out for accuracy and validity, how you can look at them from different perspectives. Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do in front of you by using this critical incident questionnaire. So again, however way you can find as a teacher to model critical thinking from a student point of view, this seems to be the most helpful strategy of all. And finally, just to kind of end up my remarks with one thing that I personally have found very, very helpful in this regard. I have a lot of assumptions about my work. My work happens to be teaching. And some of them I'm so close to, it's impossible for me really to see them clearly. I think one of the problems about critical thinking is that it's very hard to do it on yourself. It's very hard just to sit down and say, okay, what assumptions do I have about this activity or this situation or this piece of material or this subject matter or this skill set? You really need to have other people involved in this activity with you. I think very much that critical thinking is a social learning process where other people act as kind of critical mirrors to you, helping you clarify your assumptions and see things from different perspectives. So one of the things I try and do is set up as many informal conversations as I can with my peers, with other teachers, and we talk over, you know, if I have a problem that I just can't seem to find my way through, I think there's a very limited utility to me just sitting alone and trying to work it out. I'm liable to get much more productive critical thought happening if I take that problem to a group of peers and say, okay, here's how I see the situation. And then they ask me questions about it, and they start to tell me the assumptions that they hear in my story, and they say, have you thought about it from this person's point of view or from this perspective? Here's a different interpretation of what you're describing, which sort of fits the facts but isn't the one that you've laid on it. To me, that's a crucial dynamic of critical thinking. I really do believe it's a social learning process, and it's one of the reasons why hunting assumptions is something I do in a lot of group activities in my classes. Critical thinking for me is a group learning process and involves a lot of intentional structuring of groups around that activity. How nice. I could talk a lot longer, but I've exceeded well the 12 minutes already, and I do want to leave some time for some reactions or questions. There is the dreaded walk of fame here up to the microphone. There's a microphone being put here, which I would never in a million years get up and walk to that mic if I was in the audience and ask a question. But if you choose to, feel free to do that. I applaud your courage in advance. Or if you just want to raise your hand and ask a question, that's fine. There's always a difficult pause at a moment like this. And for the first person to make that leap of courage, or to take pity on the poor presenter who's facing this vacuum of silence. So, oh, but there is someone here. Thank you for breaking that vacuum.
We didn't have vacuum.
That's true.
You teach at a religious school?
It's a Catholic university, yes.
Do you find teaching critical thinking can be more difficult when you are dealing with students with perhaps, how do I say it, far right or absolutism type of views of the world, such as, you know, there's no such thing as evolution and
Right. It's much harder to teach it to people who are very threatened by any suggestion that their reading of the world is anything other than absolutely divinely ordained. And although, I work with seminaries in the Twin Cities as well as the University of St. Thomas, which is a Catholic institution, and the degree of attempts to challenge that kind of rigidity is to me very active in religious education. I mean, that there are certainly people who fight not to do that at all, but there's an awful lot who are working to do that within seminaries and with religious colleges. But I think generally, one of the things I struggle most with is people who say, no, there is only one way to think about this, and I'm clearly convinced that I have the answer to that truth. And, with someone like that, I think the best you can hope for, first of all, you need to respect that point of view, I think. If you give a sense that you're in a morally superior position because you're a more sophisticated critical thinker or something than them, it seems to me that's the sort of the death of any kind of trust developing. And if you don't have a student's trust in you, then asking them to engage in this very risky, threatening activity is hopeless. At some level, they have to trust that, hopefully through your modeling of it, that you're not going to abandon them, or that you haven't predetermined what they're supposed to think in advance. So I think, and this is hard, when you're working with people who have absolutely diametrically opposed views to you, very hard to give them respect. And I had a situation in class last weekend where some of the student evaluations on the questionnaires that came back called me a hypocrite because I had shut this person down prematurely. Now, I was shutting this person down in class because I thought he was dominating so much and getting on a rant that other people in the class weren't having a chance to speak, so I was trying to control his monopolizing of discussion. But some people in the class who agreed with him saw me as being hypocritical, saying I was welcoming a freedom of thought, a critical analysis, and then dampening down a viewpoint that was inconvenient to me.